Now broadcasting from beautiful downtown Tallahassee, it's Classic Movie Reviews with Snark.
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. You can also go to snarkymoviereviews.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is a Christmas favorite featuring some great stars. The film is It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, starring the amazing James Stewart as George Bailey. Jimmy, as I will refer to him from here on, was born in 1908. At prep school, Jimmy was an athlete, musician, and actor. He was admitted to Princeton in 1929 and continued to act while studying. Following graduation, he toured with the University Players and was on Broadway in 1932. The Depression dried up any work for the young actor. In 1934, the lanky actor went to Hollywood and quickly found work in a short titled Art Trouble, 1934. And his first feature was the next year, Murder Man, 1935. His roles increased regularly, and he hit the big time in 1937, when the first of his 3 collaborations with Frank Capra was released. The movie You Can't Take It With You, 1938, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, were big hits and made Stewart a star. But he was making other movies as well, such as Destry Rides Again, 1939, co-starring with Marlene Dietrich, a movie that was spoofed in Blazing Saddles, 1974, and The Philadelphia Story, 1940, with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. He was drafted into the Army in 1940 as a private, but his education and flying experience helped him rise to the rank of colonel in the Army Air Corps. Stewart, like Clark Gable, actually flew combat missions over Europe during World War II. Stewart stayed in the reserves and retired in 1959 as a brigadier general. As a beloved everyman, Stewart's career picked right back up after the war. During his long career, he worked across virtually every genre of film. In westerns, there was Winchester 73, 1950, Broken Arrow, 1950, The Naked Spur, 1953, The Man from Laramie, 1955, Two Rode Together, 1961, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962, with John Wayne, Cheyenne Autumn, 1964, where he took the role of Wyatt Earp, The Cheyenne Social Club, 1970, and The Shootist, 1976, which was John Wayne's last movie. He had a few biopics such as The Stratton Story, 1949, The Glenn Miller Story, 1954, The Spirit of St. Louis, 1957, and Carbine Williams, 1952, about a prisoner that invented the M1 rifle used in World War II. Stewart starred in 4 Alfred Hitchcock thrillers. These films were Rope, 1948, Rear Window, 1954, The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956, and Vertigo, 1958. Other great movies by Stewart include Harvey, 1950, where only he could see a giant rabbit, No Highway in the Sky, 1951, again with Marlene Dietrich, where Stewart's character was predicting a plane crash, The Greatest Show on Earth, 1952, where he was a murderer on the run hiding as a circus clown, Strategic Air Command, 1955, Anatomy of a Murder, 1959, which shocked the public because of the explicit topic, Mr. Hobbs Takes a Vacation, 1962, where he takes a family vacation way before the Griswolds, Shenandoah, 1965, playing a man of faith looking for his children during the Civil War, and finally, The Flight of the Phoenix, 1965, where Stewart is a down-and-out pilot marooned with crash survivors in the Libyan desert. Of course, It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, may be his most beloved role. Stewart worked until near his death at the age of 89 in 1997. Donna Reed played Mary Hatch. Reed was born in Iowa in 1921. She was a beauty queen, and when she went to college in Los Angeles, she was noticed by MGM talent scouts and received a contract. Her first film was The Getaway, 1941. Through the 1940s, Reed received increasingly better roles, mostly as a wholesome girl-next-door type. In 1953, she flipped this image on its head when she played hostess Alma, Reed prostitute, in From Here to Eternity, 1953. For this role, she won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. Showing her range, she starred in The Caddy, 1953, a comedy with Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. She handled the role of Sacagawea in The Far Horizon, 1955, with Charlton Heston and Fred MacMurray as Lewis and Clark. In 1958, she began working on television in The Donna Reed Show, 1958 to 66. She continued to work but at a reduced rate through the 1970s and early 80s. In 1986, 2 weeks before her 65th birthday, Reed died of pancreatic cancer. Lionel Barrymore played mean old rich man Mr. Potter. We covered Barrymore in episode 40, Key Largo. Thomas Mitchell played the role of scatterbrained Uncle Billy. The child of Irish immigrants, Mitchell followed his father into the newspaper business. He expanded this into writing for theater and by 1913 decided to become a stage actor and debuted on Broadway in 1916. He was in his first film, A Silent, in 1923. Mitchell was cast in Frank Capra's Lost Horizon 1937 as an embezzler. The next year he worked with director John Ford in The Hurricane 1937. The year of Mitchell should be 1939. He had 5 films come out in this cinematically magical year. These films were John Ford's Stagecoach 1939, The Hunchback of Notre Dame 1939, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, Only Angels Have Wings, 1939, and of course, Gone with the Wind, 1939, in the role of Scarlett O'Hara's father. Other great supporting roles include It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, and High Noon, 1952. He continued to work through 1961, passing away in 1962. Henry Travers played the role of Angel Clarence. English-born Travers immigrated to the U.S. in 1917. First he worked on Broadway and then entered movies with his first film, Reunion in Vienna, 1933. He had a lot of grandfather-type roles in films such as High Sierra, 1941, The Bells of St. Mary's, 1945, and It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. He played a doctor in The Invisible Man, 1933. Travers retired from film in 1949 and died in 1965. Beulah Bondi played George's mother, Mrs. Bailey. Born in 1888, she was active on Broadway by 1925. She took her first movie role at the age of 43 in 1931. She was cast as mothers or grandmothers mostly, and even played Jimmy Stewart's mother 4 times. Some of her roles include Trail of the Lonesome Pine, 1936, The Gorgeous Hussy, 1936, love that title, Of Human Hearts, 1938, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, Our Town, 1940, The Shepherd of the Hills, 1941, with John Wayne and Harry Carey, and Penny Serenade, 1941. Many consider her best role to be the Depression-era Make Way for Tomorrow, 1937. Bondi worked in films until 1963 and in television until 1976. She died in 1981 after she suffered broken ribs from tripping over her cat. She was 92. Frank Faylen played the role of taxi driver Ernie, the same business he was in episode 38, 99 River Street. Ward Bond played the role of Bert the Cop. A gruff guy, Bond was born in Nebraska in 1903. Bond became friends with John Wayne while they were at the University of Southern California, and Wayne helped him to get work as an extra. Bond was in John Ford's Salute, 1929, and became friends with him as well. Later he would be in almost every John Ford and John Wayne film. Some of his other films include Son of Frankenstein, 1939, The Grapes of Wrath, 1940, The Maltese Falcon, 1941, Sergeant York, 1941, and Gentleman Jim, 1942. Bond was a proponent of blacklisting in Hollywood during the 1950s. He had a television show, Wagon Train, 1957 to 61. In 1960, he traveled to Dallas for a football game and died of a heart attack in his hotel room. Gloria Grahame played misunderstood sexpot Violet. Grahame was born in Los Angeles in 1923. Her mother was an actress and she was raised to do the same. She left Hollywood High School before graduating and joined a touring company. When she was in a Broadway play, she was spotted by Louis B. Mayer. And given an MGM contract in 1944. Her first film role was as Sally Murfin in Blonde Fever, 1944. However, it was her role in It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, that made her stand out from the other starlets. For some reason, MGM didn't think she was right for them and sold her contract to RKO. Her RKO films include It Happened in Brooklyn, 1947, and Song of the Thin Man, 1947. However, Crossfire, 1947 made her a bigger star. She was nominated for an Oscar for Gentleman's Agreement 1947 and won the Oscar for The Bad and the Beautiful 1952. In between these films, she was fantastic in The Greatest Show on Earth 1952. She made two important films in the 1950s, the musical Oklahoma 1955 and Odds Against Tomorrow 1959. Her roles began to slow during the 60s and 70s. Her last films were Melvin and Howard 1980 and The Nesting 1981. She died of cancer in 1981 at the age of 57. H.B. Warner played the mean old pharmacist Mr. Gower. Warner was born in England but made it to America in the early 1900s. After stage work, he made his film debut in a short titled Harp of Tara, 1914. He began working with Cecil B. DeMille in 1914 and was cast as Jesus in DeMille's The King of Kings, 1927. When talkies came in, he was a popular supporting actor. His films include Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, 1936, Lost Horizon, 1937, You Can't Take It With You, 1938, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, The Devil and Daniel Webster, 1941, Topper Returns, 1941, and of course, It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. He played himself in Sunset Boulevard, 1950, I assume as part of Norma's Crypt group. His last credited role was in DeMille's The Ten Commandments, 1956, and he had an uncredited part in Darby's Rangers, 1958. Warner died in 1958 at the age of 83. William Edmonds played Mr. Martini. Edmonds was born in Italy in 1885 with a different name. He was cast in roles of various ethnic types. His best-known roles are when he was cast as an Italian in films such as Bells for Adano, 1945, The Lost Moment, 1947, and It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. He also had a role in House of Frankenstein, 1944. He died in 1981. Robert J. Anderson played young George Bailey. We mentioned Anderson briefly in episode 52, The Bishop's Wife, 1947. Sheldon Leonard played the role of bartender Nick. He was discussed in episode 41, Zombies on Broadway, 1945. Carolyn Grimes played one of the Bailey children, Zuzu. We mentioned Grimes in episode 52, The Bishop's Wife, 1947 as well. Story. The movie begins with prayers going up from the idealized town of Bedford Falls, New York. It then switches to a view of space galaxies talking to each other about a man on Earth who has lost his way. The man is named George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart, and he is about to commit suicide. The angel that is on deck is no Dudley. He is Angel Second Class Clarence, Henry Travers, and he hasn't earned his wings yet. They describe Clarence as a former clockmaker and having the IQ of a rabbit and the faith of a child. The deities summon Clarence and explain the problem. They decide that most of the time will be spent looking back at George Bailey's life so they can understand how he arrived at the point of wanting to end his life. The first time I ever saw this movie was on Christmas Eve when I was stationed in Germany. It was at this point that the signal went out, and I had to wait almost another decade to find out what the story was about. This was way before the internet. The Earth Cam opens up with young George Bailey, Robert J. Anderson, and some other kids sledding down a hill onto an ice pond. When George's younger brother Harry, George Noakes, comes down the hill, he goes too far and breaks through the ice. George jumps in without hesitation to save his brother. As a result of the cold and a later infection, George loses all the hearing in his left ear. Weeks later, when George is well, he goes back to his afternoon job at Old Man Gower's drugstore. When the boys are walking George to work, they see Mr. Henry Potter, Lionel Barrymore, riding in a black carriage that seems more like a hearse. They say he is the richest and meanest man in town. The character Monty Burns from The Simpsons is at least partially based on Henry Potter. The year is 1919 and the Great War has just ended, but the Spanish flu is killing indiscriminately. Mr. Gower, H.B. Warner, is drinking and yelling at George for being late. Young Mary, Jean Gale, is waiting at the soda fountain for George. Young Violet, Jeannie Ann Roos, soon arrives. The two girls are vying for George's attention. George just wants to travel and do things. After Gower yells again, George sees a telegram that says Gower's son died from influenza. In the back, George sees that Mr. Gower has accidentally mixed poison in the medicine George is supposed to deliver. George goes to the Bailey Building and Loan to get advice from his father, Peter, Samuel Hines. Peter is in a meeting with Mr. Potter, and George's uncle, Billy, Thomas Mitchell, won't let him into the office. When Billy has to return a call to the bank examiner, George slips into the meeting. When Potter calls Peter a failure, George screams that his pa is the biggest man in town and he is ushered out of the meeting. George goes back to the pharmacy without delivering the medicine. When Mr. Gower finds out, he starts slapping George and makes his bad ear bleed.
What is Miss Blaine for the capsules? Did you hear what I said?
Yes, sir.
What kind of tricks are you playing anyway? Why did you run into the limit right away? Don't you know that boy makes tricks?
My son here.
You lazy loaf.
Mr. Gower, you don't know what you're doing. You put something wrong in those capsules.
Was that acceptable work practice? The young Violet watches the beating George takes. George tells Gower that he put poison in the medicine and excuses him because he was distraught. He then promises he will never tell as Gower begs for forgiveness. The movie jumps forward in time and George, Jimmy Stewart, is getting ready to leave town. He is buying a large suitcase, and when he picks it out, he finds out that Mr. Gower has already paid for it. Hush money, I guess. George plans on leaving on a cattle boat for Europe. He goes through town saying farewell to his friends. He meets two of his friends, Ernie, Frank Faylen, the cabbie, and Bert, Ward Bond, the policeman. Up-to-date information is trending towards this not being the place where the Muppets of the same name got their moniker. Grown-up Violet Bick, Gloria Grahame, comes by, and all of the men are smitten.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bailey.
Hello, Violet. Hey, you look good. That's some dress you got on there.
What? This old thing? Well, I only wear it when I don't care how I look.
At home, George and his brother Harry, Todd Carnes, are getting ready to go to Harry's high school dance. Dad Peter, Mom Beulah Bondi, and maid Lillian Randolph are trying to serve dinner. George refers to the Bailey boarding house and he says his father looks tired. Peter says it's because he has been fighting with Potter. George has been working at the building and loan for 4 years and he plans to go to college after his trip. George wants to build bridges and cities. Although he respects his father, he needs to leave. Peter explains that giving homes to people is just as important. At the dance that night, George sees his old friends, including Sam Wainwright, Frank Albertson. He is asked to dance with one of his friend's little sister, Mary Hatch, Donna Reed. George and Mary are dancing away when someone pushes the button to open the gym floor and dumps him into the swimming pool. All the rest of the dancers jump in for fun. George and Mary walk home in borrowed dry clothes. George is getting a little Twitter-pated. Mary talks about how she would like to live in the old Granville house as George throws a rock at the abandoned structure. A man on the porch watching yells at the pair, "Why don't you kiss her instead of talking her to death?"
And the moonbeams that shoot out of your fingers and your toes and the ends of your hair. Am I talking too much?
Yes. Why don't you kiss her instead of talking her to death?
How's that?
Why don't you kiss her instead of talking her to death?
Mary loses her robe and hides in the flowers. About this time, Uncle Billy and Harry drive up and tell George that his father has had a stroke. His father dies and George does not go on his trip to Europe. He is ready to leave for college when Potter tries to dissolve the building and loan. After the board meets, they say the only way they will not close the building and loan is if George takes over. George reluctantly agrees to run the building and loan. George gives his college money to his younger brother Harry so he can attend college first. The plan is that when Harry comes back from college, he will take George's place and George will go to college. Brother Harry was an All-American football player at college. 4 years later, when he returns, he has married a girl from school, Ruth Dankins, Virginia Patton. Harry is also taking a job from Ruth's father and won't be living in Bedford Falls. George's plans are sunk again and he remains stuck in Bedford Falls. George's mother tells him that Mary Hatch is back from college. George thinks she plans on marrying Sam Wainwright. George heads downtown and runs into Violet. She is looking great as usual. George's idea of a good time and hers are very different.
What are you doing tonight?
Nothing.
Are you game, Vi? Let's make a night of it.
Oh, I love it, Georgie. What'll we do?
Let's go out in the fields and take off our shoes and walk through the grass.
Huh?
Then we can go up to the falls. It's beautiful up there in the moonlight. And there's a green pool up there. And we can swim in it. Then we can climb Mount Bedford. and smell the pines and watch the sunrise against the peaks, and we'll stay up there the whole night, and everybody will be talking. There'll be a terrific scam.
Georgie, have you gone crazy? Why, walk in the grass in my bare feet. Why, it's 10 miles up to Mount Dashford.
Okay, just forget about the whole thing.
He finally makes his way to Mary's house. On the phone, Sam offers George a ground floor opportunity in plastics. George and Mary do a little fencing and then decide they are madly in love and will be married. George has saved $2,000 for their honeymoon trip. As near as I can figure, it's around 1932. As Ernie is driving the couple through town, they see a mob at the bank and think there is being a run on the bank. This happens when people lose faith in the institution and the people want to withdraw more money than the local reserve can supply. George runs to the building and loan to see what is happening there. When he gets to the business, there is a mob there as well. Not knowing what to do, Uncle Billy has locked the door. Earlier in the morning, the bank had called in the building and loans note. Potter uses this opportunity to take control of the bank and offers 50 cents on the dollar for building and loan shares. George tries to explain that the money is not in the bank and that it's in the homes of their neighbors. Some folks are heading to take Potter's deal. Mary hands over the honeymoon money and George is able to settle the run and make it through the day. While George was saving the day, Ernie, Bert, and Mary had fixed up the old Granville house for the honeymoon. As the couple goes in the house, Bert and Ernie serenade the newlyweds from outside in the rain. I don't know if they stole the house or just started squatting there or what. Now firmly trapped in Bedford Falls, George gets busy making people's lives better. He loans out money and builds a subdivision named Bailey Park. One of the first people that buys a house is immigrant Mr. Martini, William Edmonds, the owner of a local bar. Potter gets mad when he sees how much business the building and loan is taking from his slums. Potter calls in George and offers him a high-paying job. George is tempted, then he remembers what he stands for and rejects Potter's offer. Over time, George and Mary have 4 children as they fix up the old house. When World War II breaks out, Harry Bailey flies fighters for the Navy, Bert fought in North Africa, and Ernie parachuted into France. But George is left behind because he can't hear out of one ear. Harry shoots down 2 enemy planes and saves a transport ship carrying a lot of men. For this action, he is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in a Washington ceremony. On Christmas Eve day, everyone is getting ready for the big homecoming party for war hero Harry. Uncle Billy is sent to make an $8,000 deposit while the bank examiner waits to examine the books of the building and loan. Uncle Billy taunts Potter with the newspaper and leaves the money inside. Potter finds the money and holds onto it. Violet comes by to see George. She needs to make a fresh start, so George loans her some of his own money. She kisses him on the cheek, and the bank examiner is very suspicious. Billy tells George that he has lost the money. They retrace Billy's steps while the bank examiner watches. Finally, George has a hissy fit. He says it means scandal, bankruptcy, and prison, and he wasn't taking the rap. When George gets home, he is in a foul mood. Mary tells the upset George that their youngest daughter, Zuzu, Carolyn Grimes, has a cold and the doctor has been by to see her. She won a flower at school and walked home with her coat open. I'm not sure that's how a cold works. When George sees Zuzu, he puts a few of the flower petals in his watch pocket. The teacher calls to check on Zuzu, but George takes the phone and berates the teacher. Then the teacher's husband gets on and they have words as well. George starts raging and breaking things. He yells at the kids and has them all crying. When George leaves, Mary says the kids should pray for their father. Mary spreads the word that George is in trouble. George goes to see Potter, and Potter says that the DA is looking for George and that George is worth more dead than alive. Potter accuses him of paying off Violet.
Well, what kind of security would I have, George? You got any stocks?
No, sir.
Bonds? Real estate? Collateral of any kind?
I have some life insurance. $15,000 policy.
Yes, how much is your equity in it?
$500.
$500. And you asked me to lend you $8,000.
George goes to Martini's bar and starts drinking. George prays for help. Bartender Nick, Sheldon Leonard, is very concerned about George, as is Martini. When they say his name, the teacher's husband is in the bar and socks George in the mouth, making his lip bleed. The drunken George leaves the bar and drives his car into a tree. The owner of the tree is mad because it is the oldest tree in town. George walks onto the bridge in preparation to kill himself. Just before George drops into the frozen water, Clarence jumps in and yells for help. He suspected George was the kind of man that would jump in to rescue a stranger. The bridge operator helps get them out, and they are warming up in the shed. Clarence has a copy of Twain's Tom Sawyer. George doesn't believe Clarence is an angel.
I didn't have time to get some stylish underwear. Wife gave me this on my last birthday. I passed away in it.
When George says he wishes he had never been born, Clarence gets an idea. He shows George an alternative timeline where he has never been born. Now this is where the false equivalency comes in. It was never about whether George was born. It was about whether or not he left Bedford Falls. Everything he did up until he left would have still happened, including saving Harry. He might have went on to build great things, to help the world, or bring universal peace. The real question would be, what would happen if George was able to leave town after high school? Clarence changes the timeline. It stops snowing and George's lip stops bleeding. They walk back to where George's car was parked. The owner of the tree says the tree is the oldest tree in Potterville. The pair head up to the bar, which is now a rocking juke joint owned by Nick. Nick is an angry guy. When Clarence tries to order a flaming rum punch, Nick gets pissy.
Hey, look, mister. We save hard drinks in here for men who want to get drunk fast, and we don't need any characters around to give the joint atmosphere. Is that clear?
When Nick opens the cash register and the bell rings, Clarence says it means an angel just got their wings. Nick starts to throw them out. About this time, Mr. Gower comes in, and he is a full-on drunk. Nick says Gower spent 20 years in prison for poisoning a kid. They throw George and Clarence out. Clarence says George was not there to stop Gower. False, he would have been. George heads home without Clarence, and Potterville has pawn shops, dance halls, strip clubs, and lots of bars. He sees Violet being arrested, assumedly for soliciting. He flags down Ernie, who doesn't know him. Ernie signals Bert the cop to follow them. George acts crazy in the abandoned house where he used to live, and Bert tries to arrest him. Clarence helps George escape by biting Bert's arm. Next, George goes to his mother's house, which is now a boarding house. Harry would still be alive, and George could still send money if he had just left town after high school. She tells him Uncle Billy has been in a mental hospital for 20 years. Clarence and George go to Bailey Park, and there are no houses there. George asks to see Mary. Clarence tells George that she is an old maid closing up the library. When he confronts her, she screams and runs away. When Bert the cop shows up, George slugs him, and Bert fires several shots at George. George runs to the bridge and begs to be back alive.
Get me back! Get me back! I don't care what happens to me! Get me back to my wife and kids! Help me, Clarence, please! Please! I want to live again! I want to live again!
It starts to snow and George's lip starts bleeding again. Bert pulls up and he knows George. It takes George some time to accept that he is back. Zuzu's pedals are back in his pocket. He runs through Bedford Falls and the quaint town is back. When George gets home, the DA and the bank examiner are waiting to arrest him. He doesn't care, he only wants to see his family. The word that Mary and Billy had spread around town worked, and people come pouring in with money, jewelry, and savings. The best is when Annie drops in some funds and says she was saving for a divorce if she ever got married. Violet decides to stay in town and she returns her money. Sam Wainwright cables from London authorizing an advance for George of up to $25,000.
Now get this. It's from London.
Oh.
Mr. Gower cabled you need cash. Stop. My office instructed to advance you up to $25,000. Stop. Hee-haw and Merry Christmas, Sam Wainwright.
The bank examiner puts in $1 and the warrant is tossed in as well. Harry shows up, having flown through a blizzard to get there. Harry gives a toast to his big brother, the richest man in town.
Toast to my big brother George, the richest man in town.
In the basket, George finds Clarence's book with a note that says, "Remember, no man is a failure who has friends. Thank you for the wings. Love, Clarence." A bell on the tree rings. Zuzu says, "My teacher said when a bell rings, an angel gets his wing."
Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings.
That's right. That's right.
George says, "That's right, that's right." As he looks up, he adds, "Attaboy, Clarence." The end. Will George have to face drunk driving charges for crashing into the tree? While this movie is beloved now, it wasn't always this popular. An FBI report titled Communist Infiltration of the Motion Picture Industry 1947, cited in I'm Dreaming of a Red Christmas, stated that the way Potter was portrayed, it was an effort to undermine the upper class and promote distrust in the rich. However, Frank Capra nor any of the screenwriters were ever blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. World-famous short summary. Angel uses false equivalency to trick a man into accepting crappy life. Okay, folks, it's time to sign up for my email list as the free EPUB for subscribers will be released in early January. It's around 200 pages, has 50 reviews that are cleaned and cross-referenced, and original artwork. If you want a copy, it's completely free to list members. If you enjoyed this week's show, please tell your friends, and if you really want to help, drop over to iTunes and give me a review. If you want to comment, recommend a movie, or just say hi, follow the links in the show notes to my site. I have SpeakPipe so you can leave audio feedback as well. Beware the Moors.